Okay, so let's dial it back just a little bit.
Okay.
You know, you worked for people, you're a consultant for a firm, you're a consultant for another firm, and then one day you started MetaOps.
Yeah,
What happened there?
yeah,
Because that's a big leap.
that it is a leap. And I was, doing all this networking and building up a network of people I could pull in to work on projects, right? Consulting projects. I kept getting requests from customers saying, hey, I'm not interested in a consulting project. What I really need is somebody to just come in and get the work done. Right? Plug into my team, just do the work. I don't need a consulting engagement, anything fancy. So we realized there was unmet need in the marketplace. So in 2011, we came up with the MetaExperts brand to characterize an on-demand interim, part-time, full-time, fractional for part-time, talent solution that our customers could tap into for arms and legs that could solve difficult business problems to step in and just get stuff done.
Welcome to A State of Readiness, a podcast set as a fireside chat with business leaders to discuss what it takes for a company to be in a state of readiness and become a high-performance organization, with your host, Joseph Paris.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of State of Readiness. I'm your host, Joseph Paris. Today, my guest is Ron Crabtree, founder and CEO of MetaOps Incorporated and MetaExperts, a firm that provides interim and fractional business professionals. Ron is an internationally recognized organizational transformation expert in operations management, supply chain, and Lean Six Sigma. He has worked with customers in many industries worldwide and has a proven track record in delivering results and improving productivity, quality, and customer satisfaction. Ron holds a BA in Management and Organizational Development and is a Master Lean Six Sigma Black Belt. He holds several other distinguished certifications, including Certified Supply Chain Transformation and Master Instructor. Ron has authored and co-authored 5 books on operational excellence-related topics, including Driving Operational Excellence, available on Amazon. Welcome, Ron. Welcome to my podcast. How are you doing today?
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. We've known each other for, quite some time. And it's finally great to get you in front of my camera. So this is super.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So you and I met. You had created MetaOps well before you and I met, but we met as a function of you having founded and being the president of MetaOps. And we'll get to that in a little bit about what the inner workings are and what's, how to engage and what's its value proposition, what problems you solve, and et cetera. We'll get to that in a second. But, you have a pretty interesting story, as many, entrepreneurs do. Not too many are like me, where they just get out of university and start their firm. Most have a sort of a serpentine journey to get to their final entrepreneurial position. So why don't we share yours? I mean, you went to college, but you went out of high school, but then you went right into work. And what would happen there?
Well, when I grew up in a very blue collar family, and we had very few, family members that pursued college. So it wasn't a thing. And so I decided to get married when I was 19. My wife had been 18 for 3 whole weeks. When we got married, I was working in a factory, making cardboard boxes and stuff like that. And one thing led to another. We ended up moving to Southern California back in '78, and I got to work for this pretty cool company you might have heard of called Disney, in their manufacturing division, and where they design and build all the show and ride equipment that goes into the theme park. So they had launched the Epcot project, which didn't open until '82, and then at the same time they took on a project to build Tokyo Disneyland. So I hired in there as production scheduler in the plastics mechanical manufacturing group, and then very quickly they ramped up to 1,000 employees at that site to ramp up for Epcot and Tokyo Disneyland. So I kind of rode this wave at Disney, being trained and developed as a senior project manager. In fact, I ended, running a team of 6 project managers doing program evaluation review technique on computers in 1979, which was quite an undertaking, as you can imagine, because if you're familiar with PERT, right, it's a pretty complex network.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because computers were there in their infancy back in 1978 and 79. I mean, I don't even think that the Apple II was or the Apple One was out at the time. I think that was a 1979 or 1980 creation. I remember my father; he retired from IBM. And he started screwing around with, he was bored, right? So he came down and we
Right.
did some CAD work. And he was using AutoCAD, and he never used a mouse. So I'm showing him that how to use the mouse. You just use the mouse to point. And what he was doing was he'd look at the screen, and then he'd look at his hand, and he'd move the mouse a little bit, and then he'd look at the screen, and he'd look at his hand, and he'd move the mouse a little bit more until it got to where he wanted it to be. I said, "Pop, don't look at your hand. Just move your hand and let the cursor do its thing." But yeah, talk about your primitive computer powers back then. Now, did you run on a mini or a mainframe? What was it?
Well, actually, it was a pretty interesting scenario because basically you had to run the algorithms on a Cray supercomputer for that to
No
actually
kidding.
work. So we would sit around all day marking up green board reports and changing relationships on paper. We had a crew that would type all that in second shift. They would squirt it by modem to Philadelphia, crank the algorithms, squirt the data back to us overnight to California. We dump all those reports out in the morning, and voila, you got to see your changes from yesterday.
Awesome. Can you imagine having one of these younger folks operate in such environments today? They'd lose their minds.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So
Yeah.
picking up the story, when I was working for Disney, I actually decided to go to college. I started attending night classes at Cal State University in production inventory control back before Apex ASCM had their certifications out, purchasing training and stuff like that. So I ended up with 17 years of night school over the years and eventually graduating with an undergrad in management organization development in 1997. With zero college debt because along the way I got my employers to pay for all that. So that's how I ended up getting a degree. But we moved back to Michigan in 81 and I got into materials management and ended up going to work for an automotive supplier and very quickly being immersed in what General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were pushing on to the suppliers. Back in those days, you couldn't talk about Kaizen or use Japanese words. Lean didn't exist. The term Six Sigma didn't exist. And so I was always the person that forgot to step back in line. So I was always handling all those programs for being compliant with customer requirements, Ford Q1, Chrysler Pentastar, GM Pico's events. So I was kind of quickly immersed in, the lean Six Sigma practices before those terms even existed. And
Yeah.
along the way was implementing ERP systems and what have you. I think they implemented ERP systems at 5 different auto suppliers over the years. So ended up getting transferred with United Technologies Automotive to Detroit. They kind of plucked me out of this plant in northern Indiana to work in corporate purchasing. I was working for Kevin Smith and Bruce Jordan, who's now at Ford. Kevin came out of Toyota. They had Ed Northern, who came out of GE, one of the Jack Welch's proteges. And we were doing target and Kaizen costing in 1996. It's pretty interesting stuff to consolidate the supply chain. And I had about $1 billion worth of spend to worry about for fasteners and metal parts, all kinds of what have you. And I got recruited out to have full P&L responsibility for a publicly traded, a private equity owned organization that got a carve out. So I was general manager for one of their companies. And then finally got my degree, and then I moved into consulting when I moved to Grant Thornton. 1998 timeframe. I hired in as a senior manager, focusing on a continuous improvement kind of stuff. I was selling and implementing lean projects at Grant Thornton. And then they found out I had implemented several ERP systems. So suddenly I became the Oracle practice leader and running large scale Oracle implementations that beat the Y2K bug. I was the global subject matter expert in Oracle demand flow and implementing manufacturing, supply chain, and financial systems for several of their customers. And from there, I ended up with, at the time, the world's largest lean manufacturing consulting practice at RWD. They are headquartered in Maryland at the time, and then they had a big practice in Detroit. And they had I think, more ex-Toyota employees there than Toyota itself doing lean stuff. And initially was focused in on lean enabling technologies, and then they landed a big project at Ford. And I ultimately ended up running a team of 20 project managers and consultants doing accelerated lean deployment at Ford. So we were doing very detailed SQDCMP metric breakdown value stream maps at the workstation level and assembly plants to break down what were all the opportunities for cost out in Ford's operations. And there's lots of stories to tell about all the things that we'll learn from that. But obviously, we kind of hammered out on the Toyota anvil there a little bit. And then from there, I started our company, MetaOps, MetaExperts. We incorporated in 2002, initially as a management consulting company focused around Lean Six Sigma, supply chain, and transformation. I got very involved with thought leadership stuff. Traveling the country as a public speaker, got connected with University Alliance and helped them build out their Lean Six Sigma online programs under the Villanova University banner. And then later, when they decided to compete with ASQ, I was part of the team that actually developed the test questions, helped write the texts, and helped them elevate that program to take it to that level. And then later contracted with University Alliance to develop 32 weeks of online training in supply chain and lean supply chain. And so that was a very interesting experience, online programs. And then more recently, I've been kind of the voice of Six Sigma, if you will, for Skillsoft. It's a large international e-learning company that most corporations tap into their knowledge base. So if people are subscribed to Skillsoft and taking their Six Sigma classes, they're going to hear my chirpy voice.
Okay, so let's dial it back just a little bit.
Okay.
You know, you worked for people, you're a consultant for a firm, you're a consultant for another firm, and then one day you started MetaOps.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Yeah,
because that's a big leap.
Yeah, it is a leap. And I was doing all this networking and building up a network of people I could pull in to work on projects, right? Consulting projects. I kept getting requests from customers saying, hey, I'm not interested in a consulting project. What I really need is somebody to just come in and get the work done. Right? Plug into my team, just do the work. I don't need a consulting engagement, anything fancy. So we realized there was unmet need in the marketplace. So in 2011, we came up with the MetaExperts brand to characterize an on-demand interim, part-time, full-time, called fractional for part-time, talent solution that our customers could tap into for arms and legs that could solve difficult business problems to step in and just get stuff done.
Okay, so, and of course, not just arms and legs, brains too, right? A bunch of
lots of brains, lots of gray beards.
So, we're contemporaries in that regard, aren't we? So you found this need, or you sensed this need, then you made the leap. Now, obviously, you just didn't start like, I don't even know if LinkedIn existed at the time. Fortunately, you had a bunch of engagements and a bunch of people you had met over the course of your career. And, just based on my experience with you, you keep in touch with these people over an expanse of time, whether or not there's a transaction in the offing. You in that regards, I think that you're very, you live a very karmic existence. You don't live a transactional existence. The conversations that we've had have never been about like, what do you got for me today kind of thing. You know what I mean? It was always about philosophical exchanges or, tool exchanges or exchanges of experiences, not like, what do you got for me today? So how did you come up with, for lack of a better term, deconstructing their DNA to identify what their, if they're a superhero, what their superpowers were? You know what I mean? What kind of opportunities you would plug them into, or when an opportunity would arise, you would immediately think of this person, that person, the other person as suitable fits.
Yeah, there's some pieces to that, Joe. One of the things that we realized that if we were going to be in the business of helping companies with a very rapid response model is we needed to know our people really well. And over the years, we developed a very rigorous vetting process, a 300-point vetting process people go through to actually be inside our firewall and part of the community we would touch quickly to support customers. less than 10% of the people we consider to become a certified meta expert actually get through our process. And it's purposefully not easy. And, we end up doing some important things. For example, in our process, we want to talk to 3 different people they actually worked for in their career. So if you're a professional wanting to, solve big problems and be very credible and have some gravitas, if you don't have 3 people that can speak on your behalf and describe what you were good at, what you were not, that's a challenge, right? What makes you think you can be successful in difficult situations with companies where the chips are down? We got to get it done. So that's a piece of the puzzle. Linked to that, we have what we call our 47-point customer alignment worksheet process. So on the other side of it, when the customer has demand, we stop and say, look, let's talk for 20 minutes. And we've got a whole thing we go through and just say, so help me understand the situation. Let's articulate very clearly what good is. What is a good outcome? And then tell me how I would measure success. What are the metrics, the things I can hold this meta expert accountable to step into and help you accomplish some specific aim that you want to do? And then we talk through some other things. On a 1 to 5 criticality rubric, we get at what about their ability to train, assess, coach, do project program management, work through all that. We talk about industry pedigree, and then we have a special section just about this on soft skills. So how important is it if they can influence people without position power? Do they need to be a great rah-rah cheerleader, or are you really looking for somebody with a super deep technical background? And you guys will manage change management yourself, right? And we work through all that, work through the budget and what have you. So that's another piece of the puzzle. The third component is we do have a rather robust customer relationship management program we built out over the years. So we have a huge repository. I mean, when folks go through our vetting process, they could spend a couple of hours just in the skills inventory part that we capture to really get a granular understanding of which ISO standards are they familiar with, which quality systems, do they have finance background, do they have a supply chain background, which industries in particular that they have deep expertise, how many years of that do you have? So then when a customer shows up and says, hey, I need help, then we can draw that down, right? So our approach is we're not a resume shop. We differentiate. We'll talk more about that later. We'll differentiate around understanding what it takes to actually fix difficult business problems. We have a massive repository of intellectual property that our customers tap into, and we draw it down to really clear problem statement, right? Einsteinism. The formulation of the problem is often more essential than the solution. So we really are big believers in clear problem statement. And then we're only going to provide 2 or 3 candidates, which we know from a technical perspective will absolutely nail it. What they're testing for is personal style, communication, where they fit in, what they like working with this person as part of their team.
So I've got to ask a couple of questions here. When you started MetaOps, I would suspect that you didn't have this infrastructure in place. So obviously necessity is the mother of invention, right? I mean, and there's got to be some experiences there that precipitated out the need. What caused you to create these various vetting processes and definition processes and what have you? And I'm sure it's not version.done. It sounds like this is something that's ongoing and continually improving. But what was was there any impetus for you to say, geez, I got to create this vetting process. I got to create this process. Anything there?
Yeah, I mean, you don't scale into a multi-million-dollar business without having the ability to automate a lot of stuff. And we learned very quickly that to manually and mentally try to keep track of, I mean, back when we had 200 or 300 meta experts in our community, I could sort of keep them in my head a little bit. When we got to 1,000, now pushing 1,100, that's a big community you got to keep track of. So as a practical matter, we found it was essential that we could automate much of the process. So once we understand from a customer what the critical criterion are, we can then pull from our database the likely candidates, figure out who we should actually invite to the opportunity, communicate with them in about 2 hours, and have an actual emails and text going in their inboxes within 2 hours time at the end of that conversation with the customer. Then there is a manual process, right? Checking with people, understanding what's going on for them. If this is
Right.
really something they can do, blah, blah, blah. And then from there we go on. So we have a ton of automation we built into this because you can't, field 30, 40 different opportunities at the same time if you've got to spend several hours on each one every day trying to
Right.
manually do all that. You just can't do it.
Right. Now, I would assume that in a given opportunity, you divest to the MetaExperts the development of their scope of work for any given opportunity. Instead of you saying, I'm going to hire you and this is your scope of work and this is what your budget is, I would guess that you forward collaborate with them as to what that scope is going to be and what the budget's going to be, what the allocation is going to be, if they are going to have to include other teammates and so on and so forth. In that regard, you're almost like a general contractor. Is that inaccurate?
Well, yeah, that's not a bad analogy. It's a practical matter. Remember, we're doing this 47-point customer alignment worksheet up front.
Right.
And part of that chunk in the middle around what good looks like, what they need to do, etc., is the foundation for a basic statement of work. So when we execute that simple memo of understanding to engage a meta expert, usually we just say, refer to the 47-point checklist. And then here are the things that's going to happen. First, they're going to meet with you and sit down and actually detail the plan and then work down through if they need to do a diagnostic. What's the diagnostic look like? Is there an information request they need to do? And of course, we have templates for all that in the library.
Right.
So we're not going to make them invent it. But as a practical matter, the vast majority of our meta expert community are people like ourselves, 30 plus years of experience. It's not their first rodeo. They've got their own stuff, their own methods. So, invariably, they kind of have a little cookbook of their own they've been very successful with. And
Right.
if the customer likes it, they're off to the races. In other cases, which does happen, some of our customers are management consulting companies. And they'll tap into us for talent, when they need to scale quickly or it's not an area of expertise they can handle.
Right.
And they might have their own playbook. So it's not uncommon that the customer has lean training materials they want them to use, or they already have a program management office in place. They just want them to plug into and use their existing infrastructure. They don't need them to reinvent that. So it's definitely kind of a moving thing. And to your point, it's very much a start with discovery, but we don't try to do all that up front. Traditional management consulting involves a very lengthy process of defining, statement of work and blah, 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 blah. And I learned, having done that many times over the years, that the only constant is change. So if you spend 2 or 3 months building up a statement of work, I guarantee within 2 weeks of getting started, some of the assumptions are broken.
2 weeks? It takes 2 weeks for that?
For 2 days.
Yeah,
or 2
really.
hours or 2 hours.
Yeah, I get the opportunity to help stand up a bunch of OpEx programs. That's one of my superpowers, And people will say, I want an OpEx program or a continuous improvement program or a lean program, and they haven't the foggiest idea what they really want. What are the KPIs? What is their North Star? And I find that it's almost, when you really push comes to shove, it almost never comes down to cost as being the driver. There's, cost is the symptom. There's always some other underlying cause that manifests itself in costs. Usually it's quality or usually it's speed. I see speed being a major issue, like time being the enemy. So when you get an engagement, how do you handle those, we'll call it immediate redirects that are inevitably going to happen?
Well, every customer is different, right? So there's how savvy and experienced is the customer, where is it this expert's plugging in? If they're plugging in very much at the top, where they're bringing all that knowledge and expertise, it's their job, right? And the engagement to actually sit down with the customer and work through all that and actually build that out very quickly. For all of our customers, we like to have a weekly quality review, right? So every week for at least the first month, I want to get that customer, one of my talent specialists, get that customer on the phone and talk about what's going on with that engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've learned long ago that problems are not like fine wine, fill in the blanks, right? They don't get better with time. So I'm a big believer in, get stuff out front. So if we're having issues, there's disconnects, whatever, get it on the table and deal with it very, very quickly. You can't allow that to fester. From there, at the more senior levels, you work your way down to more tactical. For example, some of our customers have a playbook. They just need somebody to come in and actually execute the playbook, right? Be it a Lean Six Sigma, black belt, that can lead Kaizen events and actually engage with people and do the nitty gritty for the analysis and getting them through the process. They just need arms and legs to get the work done, quality engineers. Some cases that are, it's an industrial engineering problem. I need somebody who comes in and really understands plant layouts, have experience in this industry, understand certain technologies, to bring that knowledge to bear so we can quickly sort the wheat from the chaff. An analogy I like to give is, particularly if you're doing something new, right? Getting into a new technology, a new piece of business, whatever. People and organizations all get to do things the first time as an amateur.
Right.
And we get to pay for our education with false starts, taking a lot of time. There's a lot of waste in that. So some of our customers find it pretty attractive. Somebody that's had a few cycles of doing that, crushing their learning curve, can be very important.
So one of the things that that we touched on earlier, and I want to circle back to it, is the curriculum that you've created. When you and I met each other, I think it was for the first time we met each other back in October in Florida when we were doing the design thinking for OpEx.
That was the first in-person
training.
meeting.
Yeah, the first in-person.
in-person.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. You talked about how you had created a whole curriculum for moderator and facilitator training. And you also mentioned earlier on that you had created other trainings. So why don't we share with that a little bit? Some of the trainings that you've created. What is the delivery mechanisms and such like?
Yeah, it's a pretty rich portfolio of stuff there. Obviously, since I was involved with a lot of thought leadership activities, I've probably worked with more than 30 universities and corporations around building out their center of excellence and what their knowledge base is. It's pretty cool companies like Prudential Retirement, Central States Funds. I did a ton of work here in Michigan with the state of Michigan, worked with several different state departments, helped them put together their OpEx programs. And obviously accumulated a ton of intellectual property as a byproduct, working with all these customers over the years. 7, 8, 10 years ago, I had this epiphany that, the technical stuff in Lean Six Sigma isn't the problem. It's the soft skills, right? You got to have the ability to engage people, their hearts and minds, and get them involved. So I went through some training along the way on how to be a great public speaker and all those sorts of things. And I basically said, you know what, we need something more for people who are going to lead transformation. They need just a little more than they're getting in college, and they need a lot more than they're getting out of typical Lean Six Sigma training programs. They needed the soft skills stuff. So I actually created a program I call Top Facilitator. If you can imagine a Venn diagram, right? So you've got one circle in the Venn diagram being all that OpEx, Lean Six Sigma technical stuff, all the things we bring into play when we're trying to do transformation, digital transformation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another big circle in the Venn diagram would be all the things we should be taught in college, right? High-performing teams, organizational dynamics, basic change management, structure, program management, all that kind of stuff, right? So that's typically pretty organizational specific. The third circle in that Venn diagram would be the personal skills. It's the individual that's in front of others whose job it is to engage, educate, inform, motivate, and lead. And there's a basket load of skills in there. I call it, I have 33 habits of successful facilitators of transformation. It's kind of something that boiled out of that. And so there's actually like 2 days of development training that's possible. It could be online, in person, whatever. And as a point of interest, I've continued over the years to deliver a lot of Lean Six Sigma Green Belt level training. Kind of have my own deck for doing that, my own version of value stream mapping with some pretty elaborate swim lane chart techniques layered into Excel. But one of the things I started doing about 10 years ago is just talking to my customers and saying, look, we can do this Lean Six Sigma training, but I can tell you right now that most students are going to exit with knowing about Lean Six Sigma, but really not practically able to lead it. In almost every case, once I explain this top facilitator concept, for a 5-day Lean Six Sigma class that I teach, the first day is nothing but how to be a great facilitator, how to engage people, how to lead difficult conversations, what is Socratic questioning, how do you draw people out and engage them? And then for the remaining 4 days, we learn about Lean Six Sigma, but at the same time, we're practicing the facilitation skills on practice projects. And during that next 4 days, I actually run the life cycle of a transformation project as part of the class. So my goal, and the thing I've always been a big passion about, is let's not learn about it, let's learn how to do it. And to learn how to do it, no, we're not going to teach you 100 different things on the Lean Six Sigma tool bag. We're going to teach you a dozen at a level of granularity that you can do something with right away. And those are carefully selected, right, based on the problems the organization faces, and tweaked if it's service sector or manufacturing or something else, and then run that through. So I'm a big believer in the learn by doing type model. And so that's been very successful over the years. And in fact, I always at the end of each class, anything I teach, I try to make time to get feedback.
Right.
And I always ask for people to, rate us, and we always get, 8 out of 10 on average in terms of really liking the training. But then I always ask, what was the best thing about this training, right? 7 out of 10 people will put the facilitation skills in the top 3. It's the most important thing they got out of the training.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've all been to, university and classes and lectures. And, the professors, the teachers that were the very best were the ones that were the most engaging. They weren't just reading from a script. They weren't lecturing as much as they were engaging.
Right.
And I think that is a key to success in facilitation. That and having 2 ears and 1 mouth and making sure you listen twice as much as you talk. But how do you deliver? You said in person, online. Is all of your material available as self-study online? Is it, how? Walk me through or share with the audience. If somebody wanted to get training from you, what are the different options? Both in what's available and how it's delivered.
Well, there's a ton of options, obviously, and it depends, right? So what's your objective? If you're just looking to, provide general awareness, etc., there's all kinds of relatively inexpensive programs. We have lots of partners out there to offer lean training. They've got commercial off-the-shelf content, which is very good. Now, if that's all you're after, you probably don't want me because you can't afford me anyway, okay? But I can certainly line up one of our MetaExperts to do something like that as well. So I'd like to do some discovery on the front end and just really understand what good would look like. In other words, so tell me, who are the students coming into this, and what is it exactly you want them to do at the end of this? And are you looking at kind of a white belt level of just basic awareness for leaders so they can be better participants in OpEx and improvement programs? Or are you looking for people on the other end of the continuum that can actually scope, prepare for, do discovery, data collection and analysis, and then lead a team through actually fixing an important enterprise problem? That's a massive continuum,
Right.
You have to work through. And then inside of that is what organizational knowledge already exists. Every company I've talked to has started a lean initiative at least 3 times along the way, right? So there's an embedded level of understanding within organizations. So I don't like to teach something they should already know, or teach something that's already part of their psyche. So let's figure out what you already know, and let's tag onto that, and then build out what's needed to take that organization to the next level.
Yeah.
Right. From there, I have delivered that. I once led that similar activity for one of the world's most renowned graduate schools, a university out in New York. And one of our MetaExperts was involved with them. And I sat in my office for about 3 hours a week for several weeks, and we completely re-engineered their admissions process for graduate students, which for them was a big problem. And they had to really get people together. We did all that just online. We do an hour or 2 of training, then we go work on it for a few days. We come back, do an hour or 2 of training, and practice the skills and actually implement it. So that's kind of a low touch, I'll call it minimally intrusive type of approach. And on the other end of the continuum is, pretty invasive, where, okay, we're going to spend 6 weeks just in the pre-work cycle. You're going to bring all your people in. We're going to make them aware of some of these things. And there's a big training session, put them to work gathering a big deck of data They do all the analytics to really understand what needs to be worked on, how we're going to measure success, what are the metrics and the KPIs. Out of that, developing out, okay, here's what we're going to actually teach in the first sprint. And then we go in for a whole week with value stream maps we'd already created in the pre-work, all the data sets, all the pain points already captured from the customers that we're serving for these projects. And then we have teams. I like to have 3 or 4 teams with 3 or 4 different projects, and we actually work through actual business problem projects. Had a lot of success doing that First Tech Federal Credit Union out of Oregon. Lots of trips to Portland. Fun people.
Yeah. So you mentioned about companies having 2 or 3 iterations of their programs. I want to bend your ear on experience. What I see is oftentimes, maybe it's not the first iteration, maybe it's not the second, maybe it's not even the third, but one of those iterations is largely successful. And what I find is that usually that success is going to mean that the person that was responsible for that success is going to get promoted. And oftentimes they get promoted out of that role. And I believe that companies do a very, very poor job of passing the torch, from one successful leader of a program, passing that torch to the other, because usually that promotion is pretty quick. In 30 days they're going to be in their new role. In 30 days that means that they have to pass their magic dust, their program management magic dust to the next person, and they don't know necessarily that next person's capable. But even so, even if that person was largely capable, the amount of information that's being passed, you lose fidelity. You lose intrinsic knowledge of what made it successful. God forbid, within another 6 months, it passes on to yet another person. So have you experienced that? Because I've observed it. Have you experienced it? And do you have any mechanisms that you'd like to share to prohibit or reduce the lack of fidelity passing from one to the next?
It's a massive problem. A lot of it depends on the context within which they introduced lean. If they had success, what did that look like? Was it because they had one single individual who really stood out, had the ability at the right level, really engage and get some things done? They didn't become part of the psyche of the organization. So one of the things I try to convince companies to do is set up some kind of central, I'll call it a center of excellence. Mm-hmm. Others might call it a business operating system office. Like some people like the Danaher operating system, Toyota production system, give it a name. But basically, building into the company's psyche this approach to how we do business. Right? For example, I had success with advanced drainage systems. They've been very successful over the years of leveraging lean within their operations, and they were able to, create this vision, right, where they wanted to be 10 years out, and then they kind of built that into their operating system. Mm-hmm. And began to build out kind of these basic things you need to know. So they began to create this funnel, right, of people coming up through the ranks that were demonstrating success. So then as they needed to move people on, it wasn't that difficult. I haven't talked to Dave there in a while, but I probably should give him a call. He had a lot of success over the years of, having some continuity of that. So it really takes kind of a top-down commitment to that. It takes some longevity. Part of the problem is you've got, publicly traded companies being whipped by Wall Street. You churn out the managers because they're not performing well, and the new managers come in with a different idea about how we ought to do things. So a lot of things die on the vine there. Private equity owned or driven organizations, they're buying those organizations to improve them and sell them. Right. Well, whoever buys them may or may not, want to maintain that. And then where you get good continuity is, I'll call it privately owned organizations that have a longer, window for how what they're willing to commit to. They've had a lot of success. Organizations like nonprofits have reasonable success because their leadership teams tend to have a lot of continuity. Mm-hmm. Government's a whole other story because if you're not familiar with state and local government, even at the federal level, every time there's an election, we churn the top layer, right? And then everybody gets appointed and stuck in there and gets to decide how we're going to do things. So, right. there's a break in the continuity of leadership. So it's very difficult in those situations to get that kernel, I'll call it center of excellence, the business operating system, or something to make that really sticky as the fabric and the psyche that this is the way we do business. This is how we talk about business problems. These are the minimum expectations of you. I kind of like, a Toyotaism here is, you build a culture of being willing to try stuff, right? So, the story I heard at Toyota is if you're 60% confident in work, do it, even if you fail, because why? You get to learn. Another Toyotaism that I've always really enjoyed is, they work really hard to eliminate problems, right? Eliminate waste or improve their processes. And the story I heard, which I really resonated with, is when there's a mistake, something broke, right? We had a defect, an unfavorable result. The attitude is, okay, not who we're going to punish, but they literally say, we found a treasure. A treasure? Well, from that viewpoint of thank you, right? That we discovered this, so what can we learn? And they always were quick to go to the management cause side of this, right? So if you're a Deming fan, which I am, management cause is often 80% of the time, it's actually a management cause. So let's take ownership as managers and leaders that the reason it failed isn't the people or the process, it's us as leaders because we failed, our people. The upside down triangle, our people at the top and us at the bottom as leaders. That's really true. And I believe that that has to be woven into, the psyche of how we do business.
So let's talk about that because I have feelings on that also, as you could imagine. What I see oftentimes is that people become conditioned to a culture that exists. And especially if it's an autocratic culture based on punishment, and you go into the exact opposite of that, servant leadership, support, nurturing, coaching. If that new leader comes in that has this we'll call it a more contemporary approach to leadership than the old, the people that have been there for a while don't believe it, and therefore they're just waiting to get smacked on the nose like a dog in a newspaper, you know what I mean? And they're just waiting for that moment to say, aha, I knew that was a fake when it wasn't fake, you know what I mean? And so how do you overcome Stockholm syndrome, for lack of a better term?
Well, there's a lot of moving pieces to that, Joe. Part of the dynamic there is how large is the organization, right? Is it, 50 people? That's one thing, right? You can do a lot really fast at breaking that down for a small organization. If you get to 1,000 or more people with different kind of operating units, maybe even worse with different business acumens, right? So we've got 1,000 people, and 300 are doing this, and 300 are doing something entirely different customers, different markets, different products. For example, the state of Michigan Treasury. Okay, what's a Treasury department? You think about, okay, they're collecting income taxes, right? And all that stuff. But, that's one of 27 missions. If I remember correctly, 27 different missions within that one state department. Unclaimed property, gaming revenue, sharing with local governments of funding that comes in from the federal government, dispensing that out. On and on and on and on, right? So it was interesting and successful because the effort was really chartered out of the treasurer and the assistant treasurer's office. It happened the treasurer at the time was Andy Dillon, who came out of General Electric and had a Six Sigma background. And they were able to get some continuity to that. So for them, in the face of, a very difficult environment of, churning of leadership, very hard to make something stick, they were able to create an operating system, right? Focused in on the customer, improving quality and improving their performance. We had three big components to that. And they were successful because they were able to stick with it long enough to make it part of how they do business. And that was years ago now. I mean, I haven't worked in state capital in more than 10 years and still have lots of friends in Lansing. And it's because we had leadership who understood what they needed to do, and they were willing to invest the emotional and political capital, relationship capital to get it to a certain point and kind of embed it in their operating system. So that takes a while, particularly in large organizations. So generally speaking, you've got to pick a pilot, Generally I would go into an organization, so let's pick the most messy, messed up, ugly process we can, so that we can improve something about it. Everybody in the organization could recognize that, right? So you do the 80-20 thing, right? About 20% of the products or processes make up 80% of what we do. Let's pick something else, some value stream. Let's boil that down to something pretty specific, a certain kind of service, a certain product, a certain customer, or some combination of that. And then let's pick a team, right? A cross-functional team. Let's get people, if they have a union, I want union stewards involved, right? If they have, if they're involved with government, let's make sure we have all the regulatory and compliance folks involved. If it's finance, banking, something like that. We've got special requirements that we have to be compliant to. Those folks have to be involved. Let's have HR on the team. Let's have IT on the team. The IT department often gets left out, which is a big mistake. And I could go on about that for a while. They got to be on that team. And then you show them through actual behavior. And this is where leadership's got to stand up and take ownership. Get back to the management cause. And we have to have thoughtful leaders that truly are willing to invest their time and their energy in providing the correct level of leadership, and then assuring that this gets documented and codified into a repeatable process that becomes part of, this is what it means to work here. And let's just talk about culture, because this definitely relates to, you brought that up earlier. Culture exists, right? Period. So you get 2 or more people in a room, start to work together for any period of time, a culture will evolve, right? So here's the thing. Now, for us as leaders, we have to recognize that we have to make a conscious choice. We can let culture happen to us because over time it just evolves, becomes what it is. It's autocratic, top down, blah, 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 blah. Disenfranchising, treating people like machines and chattel versus really honoring people, making part of what we do. Culture is something you have to consciously plan, right? You have to define what is the culture that we value, that we have an actual acronym for my company, MetaOps. We have an acronym called CARES, CARES, and each of those has a specific thing. Customer focused, right? We're accountable, etc. Right? And then every month we have all hands meetings with our entire team around the world. And what do we do? One of the first things is we go through our code of honor, right? What does it take to be part of this organization to be successful? And I could go off about a code of honor for quite a bit here. And that's part of, by the way, of the 33 habits training. It's how do you actually lead teams through that sort of activity. And you just got to begin to build that into the psyche. So if you can have that demonstration project and really show people you actually mean it this time, and then it's just a trick of sticking with it long enough and then basically scaling it out, right? Cascading into other projects, beginning pulling in more people, more projects, then you reach a point of inflection. So I kind of like, everybody's familiar with Malcolm Baldrige, not Baldrige, but with the criticality lead, Jack Welch 10-80-10 rule. 10% of people, no matter how bad you treat them, are going to get go with you. The next 40% will come pretty quickly. The next 40%, you got to stick with it to get them right, and the last 10% never will. So you just don't even try. Right? Do something different. Reassign them, put them where they can be helpful. So you've got to stick with this long enough so you get that top 10% fully going, and to get at least, the next 20 or 30% beginning to really buy into that. After that, as long as you don't take, as long as you don't change the top leadership and completely reinvent what you're doing, you're off to the races.
All right. So let's talk about something in the past and something in the future. The past, you wrote a book.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's actually one of 5 books I've either been author or co-author of. This one's called Driving Operational Excellence, and subtitle Successful Lean 6 Sigma Secrets to Improve the Bottom Line. And it's available on Amazon. And that actually was published in 2009. And that came about because, I realized that a lot of folks were really stuck in, okay, let's do lean, right? And to me, it's always, much bigger toolbox. It has to be a lot more, conditional, right? There's only 100 different tools in the bag. What are you picking and why are you picking that? And doing that a thoughtful way. So it's actually an anthology. 27 of the smartest people I know that wrote their bits about certain chunks that they're really good at, like, value realization, value stream mapping, and some other things, all really good stuff. And at the time when I wrote the forward, this is back in 2008, I think, when we were getting all this pulled together. you may recall that Toyota had a lot of problems back then.
Yeah.
They were being dragged in front of the Senate, Toyota, executives to,
Right.
to explain why so many problems with the cars. I think it had something to do with airbags and braking systems. I don't remember exactly what it was. Then it struck me, and it's actually in the forward of the book, that what happened there? Well, here's my hypothesis. And all due respect to Toyota, they're an incredibly successful company, and I'm not putting Toyota down. But I have a hypothesis that they set the objective to become the world's largest car manufacturing company, and they kind of lost their way a little bit, right? Well, we're really going to make quality, or we're going to be the biggest company in the world. They're not the same goal, right? Those goals shifted. The other thing, my other hypothesis is they grew so fast, they couldn't maintain the muscle mass for the Toyota way quickly enough. So they began to lose their way there. Their people weren't really getting there, right, with respect to the total actual Toyota way of doing things. So I think they went a little too fast and
Right.
lost some of their muscle mass. So I think my hypothesis, and I have no scientific reason for it, but I think our objective maybe was a little bit of a misfire, and then I think they probably grew faster than they could sustain.
I think one of the things also related to that is that they assumed too much. They assumed that they're subcontractors. Takeda made the airbags, and they assumed that Takeda's level of quality was basically going to be an extension of Toyota's and the Toyota way, and that was misplaced. If only Toyota has the Toyota way, you can't expect, especially as we get separate degrees of separation, you're going to lose that fidelity. You're going to lose that alignment. You're going to lose the details. And this is not to pick on Takeda, because they didn't know what they didn't know, right? And Toyota didn't know what they didn't know with respect to Takeda and other subcontractors of Toyota. But at the end of the day, the customer, the end user, they're not buying a Takeda airbag. They're buying a Toyota automobile.
There you go.
And so it doesn't matter where the breakdown is in the supply chain. The end user doesn't care, doesn't see it. That's nuanced. It's just a problem with problem with the product that I bought, whether it's Toyota or whomever. That's where the problem is. I don't care how many, degrees of separation might have been the root cause.
Agreed.
So, and the future, something about a podcast, not the one that you're on right now, right? But you're going to produce a podcast?
Yeah, we've actually, we're going to be launching that here very quickly in April 2024. It's called Metapod. And the Metapod series, we've been very careful to, stay abreast of what it takes to be a thought leader, what it takes to actually improve performance in organizations. So the purpose of Metapod is a forum, much like this, 20, 30-minute fireside chat kind of thing, where I'm pulling in our partners, I'm pulling in some of our MetaExpert community, and talk about very topical things that are really important that we need to address. For example, in April 2024, the focus is around what's called the Defense Production Act. And without getting into that, the Biden administration, November 2023, launched a whole basket load of initiatives which provides funding, access to intellectual property, research, et cetera, to improve performance of supply chains in all of North America. Well, in that is both threats and opportunities for just about everybody in North America that has significant supply chain operations. So we have 3 episodes just really around how does that impact strategy, how does that impact your potential risk, supply chain risk and resilience plans, and then how do you tap into the funding of all that as well. And then we're rolling into the next episodes, really getting at what are the top 3 common problems we have that we all face, no matter what business we're in, right? Forever labor shortage, right? Got to do more with less, and you've got to be out in front with digital transformation. Okay, but then inside of that, you have functional areas you have to consider, like supply chain, like operations, like finance, managing people, things like that. So this is really maintaining this effort of helping people think about what's coming, right? And what people that have been there, done that, are seeing, and what they're recommending for how do you diagnose whether you have those sorts of problems in those 3 areas, or a little diagnostic. And then behind that, most importantly, what do you do? What are the actions you should take if you determine this is a threat or an opportunity for you? What do you do now? And so it's very much, giving advice is a little different. Well, it's much like this recording right here.
Right. So we've covered a lot of material today. Is there anything that we left on the truck, or have we unpacked it all?
No, I think we might talk a little bit about, how we've been able to solve customers' problems with the MetaExperts model a little more, if you're up for
Sure,
that.
absolutely. So where we
Yeah.
left it, if I'm not mistaken, where we left it, an opportunity exists, and you've already pre-vetted 1,100 MetaExperts. If I misstep on the community, the nomenclature, let me know. But I think you
Right.
referred to them as MetaExperts. The people, the opportunity will come in and they'll go through a 47-step process to quantify and define the opportunity. And then what happens?
Well, from there, it's pretty simple, actually, right? We set up an interview, give them an opportunity. Typically, they want to talk to them. I've had situations, this is true. I get a call on Friday, I need somebody on Monday to do this, and that's it. I send them, and they show up, right, and they get to work. That's pretty rare. Generally, they want to talk to them, draw the measure of the person. And if they like what they hear, they may, want to do some refinements to a statement of work. And then from there, it's pretty simple. We usually work out, a day rate or an hourly rate for the services. We'll sign a simple memo of understanding. We don't require an upfront financial commitment like management consultants might. Just allow them to engage and just go to work, right? So it's kind of like pulling somebody in to get that problem solved, and let's just get at it, right? We're not going to sweat trying to come up with a perfect statement of work, because you can't. Everything changes too quickly. And in fact, once they get in there and start to peel it back a little bit, you'll discover what the real issues are, perhaps, and then be able to need to pivot a little bit. So that part's pretty straightforward.
Okay. So where does it get a little bit more nuanced?
Well, it gets nuanced when, the discovery part is the engagement, right? They have no idea what to fix. That's where it gets nuanced really fast.
Okay. I refer to them as a diagnostic.
Yeah.
To me, like a discovery is sort of like, this is how it is. But a diagnostics goes a little step further. This is how it is, but this is where you want to go, and this is what the challenges are, and how we're going to address them. I would guess that the people that say, I need somebody on Monday, that's an established relationship where they know you, they've been satisfied with your previous engagement, so they just say, hey, Ron, I trust you. I need this firefighter on Monday. Just make it happen. And
yeah, so why don't you let me describe, a couple of scenarios where we've been pretty helpful, just to kind of give some context to that. So there's basically two things going on, right? So there's an emergency, our hair's on fire, and then there's stuff that's more strategic. So let's just tackle the first one first. So the hair on fire stuff, so for example, Good Friday 2020, COVID pandemic is raging, right? This is Easter, early in 2020. And it's Friday, it's noon on Good Friday, right? Phone rings, and it's Bob. He's the president of one of the private equity owned customers we have. And he says, listen, I got John on the phone. He's running this division in California. He's in San Francisco. We have a plant in Los Angeles making PPE for one of the large retailers, right? This would be all the screens for the cash registers, all the stuff. And we're way behind on orders. The site manager walked out today without notice. Who do you have living in Los Angeles that can be there tomorrow morning on Saturday to help us make sure we get our orders out next week? So John, we weren't flying planes at that moment. So John got in a car to drive from San Francisco to LA. Before he got there, we had 3 different MetaExperts who lived in Los Angeles on the phone with him, and he was good to go on Saturday morning. So that's kind of where the hair's on fire, and you have to make something happen, because you're literally got a burning platform, things are gonna break. Other things that tend to be kind of somewhat emergency basis, customers suddenly are like gonna crush us because our quality, we got too far off on our quality, and we're gonna need somebody to step in there that help us really get at the nitty gritty of what to fix, how to fix it. So you're looking for, a master Six Sigma black belt type. Those tend to be pretty hot. There's a big fire there. Maybe you had somebody get sick, like or somebody that's a very important part of your supply chain management team suddenly is out of the picture. And you've got an initiative underway. You need somebody that understands, the sourcing and the supply management side of that industry that can step in and just keep things going for a while until that person comes back to work. There's lots of scenarios where it's kind of, I'll call it the emergency. And
Right.
That's pretty common. The other side can be episodic or it could be more strategic. Episodic activities would be, okay, we need to move production from this plant to a different plant. That's a 3-month project. I don't have anybody that can dedicate to that for 3 months. Plus, we've never done it before. So we're amateurs. And so, we could grab a MetaExpert to actually be the project manager who's moved plants before, just plug in, work that project for 3 months and then go away. Right? So I'll call that episodic. It's not something that's going to repeat. I can't justify adding a full-time team to do that sort of thing, and they can just get this thing done and then move on, right. To other things. In other cases, it could be a bit more strategic. For example, we're entering a new market, or we're launching a new product, or we're expecting a lot of growth in a certain area, or we need to flex our capacity very quickly for a short period of time. Do I need, to hire people and put in infrastructure? Because I don't know if it's going to last, right? This is the new venture for us. It might be the amateur thing. It might be it's just we need to do a lot more of it a lot quicker, but we don't know if it's going to sustain. So that's where, an interim leader could step in. Somebody with the CEO level, at the business development level, at the engineering leadership level, at the supply chain level, or all of the above, to just plug in on an interim basis. If things sustain, right, this takes off like it should, maybe we do a contract to hire deal, let these people be hired, right, to help fill out the team permanently. Or if this thing does not go as you expected, or it was just think about the COVID pandemic. And, that caused an explosion of demand in certain areas, and then went a certain critical inflection point. Masks. Well, I have personal experience. My niece works for one of the companies that produced a whole bunch of masks, right? The N95, I think it is. So they invested like crazy, and they were a little late, and the demand went boom, zero. And now they can't even give them away.
Right. So the demand went from 0 to 100 overnight, and then from 100 to 0 overnight. Yeah,
exactly.
Hard to navigate that. So
so that's kind of a strategic thing. Maybe it doesn't make sense to invest in a 3 to 6 month hiring cycle only to find out you don't need to be there anyway.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you'd like to share?
No, I think that's pretty good for today.
Yeah, I think so too. We covered a lot of material. I mean, we covered, just to recap, we covered your journey and how you came to found MetaOps. We covered your vetting process and why that occurred, because keeping a track of 100 or 300 is easy in your head. Keeping a track of something beyond that is not so. Obviously, you're have a penchant for standardization, standard work, with the checklist for both the onboarding of your MetaExperts as well as your clients, and you got a podcast coming out, so that's all good stuff. That's all good stuff. And where could somebody find you there, Ron, if they wanted to?
Well, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Don't know how many connections, approaching 10,000 out there. And so more is always good. You can always email me at rcrabtree@metaops.com. So it's just rcrabtree@metaops.com. You can go to metaexperts.com and a couple of clicks, take a peek at the talent we have out there, or, make an inquiry there. So lots of ways to get in touch with me.
Okay. And of course, when I publish the podcast and the web page for the podcast, all that contact information will be there, and it'll be on the license plate for the podcast. So we'll make sure that we're able to put people that have a need in touch with you.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for your time, Ron. It's been a great pleasure having this conversation. I appreciate it a great deal.
Thanks, Joel. Glad to be with you here.
Thank you for listening to State of Readiness. You can discover more episodes and learn about the book written by Joseph Paris of the same title at www.state-of-readiness.com. You can learn more about Joseph Paris at www.josephparis.me/card.